Sometimes the people who should love you most are the first to give up on you. In the cold fjords of ancient Norway, Signe learned this truth when her own clan traded her away like broken goods. 3 years after a rockfall crushed her legs, they still saw her as nothing but a burden. When the legendary Jarl Einar Bearskull came to collect a debt, her kinsmen pointed at her instead of offering silver or grain. They bound her wrists and loaded her onto his longship without a second glance. But as the great vessel pulled away from shore, something strange happened. The giant warrior who could split a man in two with his bare hands looked at her not with disgust, but with recognition. He saw something her own people had missed entirely. What could this fearsome berserker possibly see in a woman everyone called worthless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Signe Eriksdottir sat beside the dying embers of her clan's hearth, her wooden walking sticks resting against the stone wall beside her. Carved from driftwood, she had found herself on the rocky shore 3 summers past. They bore the smooth wear of daily use and the careful notches she had cut to improve her grip. They were not beautiful things, but they were hers, perhaps the only possessions in the settlement that truly belonged to her anymore. Her fingers traced the familiar grooves in the wood as she watched her kinsmen prepare for the day ahead. The men sharpened their weapons and mended fishing nets, while the women ground grain and tended to the smoking fires that preserved their winter stores. Once she had been part of this rhythm, once her hands had been quick with the loom, and her voice had carried the old songs that made the work lighter. Before the mountain claimed her legs, she had been Signe the Swift, daughter of Eirik Einar, promised to the chieftain's son from the neighboring valley. Now she was simply Signe the Burden. The rockfall had come without warning 3 years ago. During the late harvest, when the clan worked desperately to gather enough stores for the harsh winter ahead. She had been carrying baskets of grain down the narrow mountain path when the earth itself seemed to groan and shift. The sound still visited her dreams, a deep rumbling that spoke of the mountain's anger, followed by the crack of splitting stone and her own scream echoing off the valley walls. When they pulled her from beneath the boulder that had crushed her legs, the bone-setter shook his grey head and muttered prayers to the old gods. Her left leg had healed crooked, shorter than the right, while her right bore scars that would never fade. The chieftain's son had withdrawn his marriage offer within the week, claiming he needed a wife who could bear strong children and work the fields. Her father had accepted this rejection without protest, his eyes already calculating the cost of keeping a daughter who could contribute nothing to the clan's survival. The transformation had been gradual but relentless. First, she was moved from the main hall to a smaller room near the storage sheds. Then her portions at meals grew smaller as her ability to contribute diminished. The young children, who once sought her out for stories, learned to avoid her as their parents whispered warnings about the bad luck that followed the crippled. Even her own brothers, Magnus and Thorvald, began to treat her with the distant politeness reserved for unwelcome guests. Yet through it all, Signe had refused to surrender entirely. She learned to move with her walking sticks, developing a grace that surprised even herself. She memorized every saga and song the Skalds had ever shared, becoming a living repository of clan history. When disputes arose, her keen mind often found solutions that eluded the warriors who relied solely on strength and tradition. But wisdom, she had learned, was a luxury her people could not afford when winter threatened and enemies gathered beyond the mountains. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her morning reverie. From her position by the hearth, she could see the riders emerging from the forest path, a sight that sent the settlement into immediate alert. At their head rode a figure that seemed too large to be fully human, mounted on a destrier that would have dwarfed most men. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the broad shoulders and commanding presence of Jarl Einar Bearskull. Signe had heard the stories, as had every soul within 100 miles of the fjords. They called him the Giant of the North, the berserker who had never known defeat, the man who could cleave through a shield wall like a scythe through wheat. His war hammer, Skull Crusher, was said to be so heavy that 3 ordinary men could not lift it, yet he wielded it with one hand while steering his horse with the other. Kingdoms had fallen before his advance, and rival jarls spoke his name in hushed tones around their own hearths. But it was not just his size or strength that made Einar Bearskull legendary. Stories spoke of his tactical brilliance, his ability to see patterns in battle that escaped other commanders. He had united the scattered clans of the northern reaches not through fear alone, but through a strange combination of ruthless efficiency and unexpected mercy. Those who submitted to him found protection and prosperity. Those who opposed him found only death. As the riders drew closer, Signe could see the man himself more clearly. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, even in the saddle, his broad frame covered in furs and leather that could not disguise the massive muscles beneath. His beard was the color of autumn oak, braided with silver rings that caught the morning light. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue like winter ice, yet holding depths that suggested a mind far more complex than the simple berserker of legend. The settlement's chieftain, her uncle Ragnar, hurried forward with the nervous energy of a man facing a predator. Behind him came the clan's elders and warriors, their hands carefully away from their weapons in a display of submission that left no doubt about the balance of power. Signe watched from her distant perch as formal greetings were exchanged, noting how even the proudest warriors seemed to shrink in the giant's presence. She knew why Einar had come. The debt had been hanging over their clan like a storm cloud for 2 full seasons, ever since Ragnar had borrowed grain and silver to survive the previous winter's famine. The terms had been generous, too generous, Signe had thought at the time, though no one had asked for her counsel. Now the day of reckoning had arrived, and their stores were barely sufficient for their own survival, let alone repaying what they owed to the most dangerous man in the northern kingdoms. As the negotiations began in earnest, Signe found herself studying the Jarl with the careful attention she had once given to her weaving. There was something in his bearing that did not match the stories, a stillness that spoke of controlled power rather than barely leashed rage. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the settlement, deep and measured rather than the roar she had expected. He listened more than he spoke, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the clan's circumstances with the calculating gaze of a man who understood the weight of both mercy and justice. The discussion grew heated as Ragnar attempted to negotiate new terms, his voice rising with desperation, while Einar remained calm as a mountain lake. From her position, Signe could see the tension in her kinsman's shoulders, the way their hands drifted unconsciously toward their weapons despite the futility of such gestures. The debt was clear, the terms were agreed upon, and the Jarl had come to collect what was owed. It was then that something unexpected happened. Einar's gaze wandered from the increasingly frantic chieftain to survey the settlement itself, taking in the modest buildings, the carefully tended fields, and the faces of the people who depended on this place for survival. His pale eyes moved methodically across the gathered crowd until they found her, sitting quietly beside the dying hearth with her walking sticks at her side. The moment stretched like a held breath as their eyes met across the courtyard. Signe felt a strange flutter in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a recognition of something she could not name. The giant warrior studied her with the same careful attention he had given to the settlement's defenses, his expression unreadable. Then, to her amazement, he inclined his head slightly, not a bow, but an acknowledgement that spoke of respect rather than pity. When Einar finally spoke again, his words carried the weight of final judgment. "I see that you have little silver and less grain," he said, his voice cutting through Ragnar's protests like a blade through silk. "But debts must be paid, and I did not ride this distance to return empty-handed." Ragnar's face grew ashen as he realized the implications. "Jarl Einar, surely we can reach some accommodation. Perhaps additional time, or a portion now and the rest." "There is something here of value," Einar interrupted, his pale eyes still fixed on Signe, "something that might serve in place of silver." The chieftain followed the giant's gaze, and visible relief flooded his features as he understood. Of course, the burden could finally serve a purpose, could finally contribute something to the clan's welfare. "Ah, yes, my lord. The girl, she is yours, if you will accept her in payment of our debt." The speed with which her own family agreed to the trade would have been shocking if Signe had not already learned the bitter lessons of her worth in their eyes. There was no hesitation, no pause for consideration of what fate might await her. Ragnar practically glowed with satisfaction at finding a solution that cost him nothing he valued. But as the warriors moved to carry out their chieftain's command, Signe found herself studying Einar's face once more. The expression she saw there was not the calculating satisfaction of a man acquiring property, but something far more complex. When his pale eyes met hers again, she saw not conquest but curiosity, not domination but an odd sort of gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with his fearsome reputation. As they bound her wrists, a formality that spoke more to clan honor than any real necessity given her condition, Signe caught herself wondering about the stories she had heard. How much of Einar Bearskull's legend was truth, and how much was the kind of tale that grew in the telling around winter fires? The man who watched her being prepared for transport seemed capable of terrible violence, certainly, but there was something in his stillness that suggested depths the stories had never captured. The giant warrior had seen something in her that her own people had missed entirely. As they lifted her onto his longship and the settlement faded behind them, Signe found herself wondering what exactly he had recognized in that long moment when their eyes had met across the courtyard. Whatever it was, it would soon define the rest of her life. The carved rune stone that had sealed her clan's fate lay half buried in the mud beside the dock, its ancient marks weathered but still legible to those who knew the old script. The debt stone, as Ragnar had called it when he first agreed to Einar's terms, bore witness to the transaction that would change everything. As Signe was carried past it toward the waiting longship, she caught sight of the runes that spelled out the agreement. Grain for winter survival, to be repaid with interest when the harvest came. Her uncle had pressed his ring into the soft clay beside those marks, sealing a bargain he never intended to honor with silver. The shock of being traded like livestock had not yet fully settled in her mind, as Einar's warriors lifted her onto the vessel with surprising gentleness. She had expected rough handling, the casual brutality that stories attributed to Viking raiders, but instead found herself supported carefully as they helped her settle against the ship's curved hull. One of the warriors, a grizzled man with kind eyes, even retrieved her walking sticks from where they had been dropped and placed them within her reach. "The crossing can be rough for those unused to the sea," he murmured quietly, his accent marking him as someone from the far northern settlements. "These will help you keep steady when the waves rise." Signe stared at him in confusion. In all her imaginings of this moment, and she had imagined it often since her accident, knowing that someday her presence would become too great a burden, she had pictured chains and cruelty, the kind of treatment befitting property rather than a person. But this warrior spoke to her as he might address his own daughter, with concern for her comfort rather than contempt for her weakness. The longship itself was a marvel that commanded respect, even from those about to become its unwilling passengers. Nearly 80 feet from stern to prow, it rode the water with the grace of a hunting predator, its dragon-carved figurehead seeming to taste the wind. The vessel bore the scars of countless journeys, salt stains on the oak planking, repairs where enemy weapons had found their mark, and the deep patina that came only from years of faithful service in the harsh northern seas. As the crew prepared to depart, Signe caught her first close look at the man who now owned her. Einar Bearskull moved about the ship with the unconscious confidence of someone born to command, checking the rigging and speaking quietly with his helmsman. Up close, his sheer size was even more intimidating, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, his hands large enough to encompass her entire skull. Yet there was precision in his movements, a careful economy of motion that spoke of intelligence guiding that massive frame. The departure came with little ceremony. Her clansmen watched from the shore with expressions of relief barely disguised as regret, already calculating how much easier their winter would be without another mouth to feed. Her brothers raised their hands in farewell, but their gestures seemed perfunctory, obligations fulfilled rather than genuine sorrow expressed. Only her cousin Astrid wept openly, though even she made no move to protest or plead for reconsideration. As the longship pulled away from the familiar dock, Signe felt the last threads connecting her to the only life she had ever known stretch and finally snap. The settlement that had been her entire world grew smaller with each stroke of the oars, until it was nothing more than a cluster of smoke wisps against the towering backdrop of the fjord walls. Everything she had been, everything she had hoped to become despite her limitations, was fading into memory. The tears came then, though she tried to hide them behind her hair. 3 years of careful control, of maintaining dignity in the face of diminishing worth, crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She wept not just for her lost home, but for the final confirmation that she truly had become nothing more than a burden to be discarded when convenient. It was then that Einar approached, his footsteps making the deck planks creak despite his careful movement. Signe quickly wiped her eyes, unwilling to show additional weakness to the man who had purchased her like a sack of grain. She expected mockery, or perhaps indifference, the kind of casual dismissal she had grown accustomed to from those who saw her disability as a character flaw rather than mere misfortune. Instead, the giant warrior settled himself on a nearby rowing bench with surprising grace for someone of his size. For a long moment he said nothing, simply gazing back toward the shore they had left behind. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it during the negotiations. Stripped of the formal authority he had wielded with her clan, "The first time I left my home, I was younger than you are now," he said, his pale eyes distant with memory. "Sold to raiders by my own father to pay for weapons he needed to defend what remained of his lands." I thought the world was ending. Signe stared at him in astonishment. The legendary Jarl Einar Bearskull had been sold by his own family. The idea seemed impossible. Surely someone of his obvious strength and intelligence would have been valued, protected, nurtured for the asset he represented. "You were sold," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from tears and sea spray. "To the Danes," he confirmed with a slight nod. "They needed rowers for their longships, and I was large for my age. My father told himself he was giving me opportunity, but we both knew the truth. He was trading his son for the chance to keep his haul for another season." The revelation transformed everything Signe thought she understood about her situation. The man who had seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, who had never known defeat in battle or politics, had once been exactly where she was now, property rather than person, traded away by those who should have protected him. "What happened to you?" she asked, her curiosity overcoming her fear for the first time since leaving shore. Einar's expression shifted, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite the serious nature of their conversation. "I learned that what others see as weakness can become strength if you have the wisdom to recognize it. The Danes saw a large boy, good for rowing and little else. They failed to notice that I was watching everything. How their leaders made decisions, how their warriors trained, how their society functioned. By the time they realized I had become more than just another thrall, I was ready to take my place among them as an equal. And then you became a Jarl yourself," Signe said, beginning to understand the shape of his story, eventually. "But first, I had to learn the most important lesson of all, that true strength has nothing to do with the size of your sword arm or the speed of your legs. It comes from here," he tapped his temple with one massive finger, "and here," he touched his chest over his heart. Everything else is just decoration." The words hung in the salt air between them like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. Signe found herself studying this legendary warrior with new eyes, seeing past the intimidating exterior to glimpse the mind that had transformed him from discarded property into one of the most powerful men in the northern kingdoms. If his story was true, and something in his steady gaze suggested it was, then perhaps her own fate was not as sealed as she had believed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, finally. Einar rose from the rowing bench with fluid motion, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I saw something in you back there, sitting by that dying fire, while your clan prepared to trade you away. Something they were too blind to recognize. What could you possibly see in a crippled woman that trained warriors missed?" "The same thing I hope you'll learn to see in yourself," he replied. "That being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have, if you're wise enough to use it." As the longship carried them deeper into the fjord, leaving behind everything Signe had ever known, his words echoed in her mind like the rhythm of the oars cutting through dark water. For the first time in 3 years, she began to wonder if her story might have chapters yet unwritten. The silver arm ring that circled Signe's wrist had been placed there by Einar himself as they approached his hall, its intricate knotwork design marking her as a member of his household rather than a slave. The weight of it felt strange against her skin, not heavy, but significant in a way that made her constantly aware of its presence. Among Einar's people, she would learn, such rings were symbols of protection and belonging, worn only by those the Jarl considered worthy of his personal guarantee of safety. The hall that emerged from the morning mist as their longship rounded the final bend of the fjord was unlike anything Signe had ever imagined. Where her clan's settlement had been a modest cluster of wooden buildings huddled together for warmth, Einar's stronghold sprawled across a natural harbor like a small city. The great hall itself rose 3 stories into the sky, its roof supported by massive oak timbers that must have come from trees older than memory. Carved dragons and ravens adorned every beam and post, their painted eyes seeming to watch the newcomers with ancient wisdom. But it was not just the size of the place that struck her, it was the activity. Even from the water, she could see people moving about their daily business with the confident efficiency of a well-ordered community. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. The sounds of hammering rang from what must be smithies and workshops. And children played in the spaces between buildings without the fearful glances she had grown accustomed to in her own clan. "It's magnificent," she breathed. Forgetting for a moment to guard her reactions, Einar followed her gaze with obvious pride. "My grandfather began building here when I was still a boy. Each generation has added to what came before. Until now, we house nearly 300 souls within these walls. Warriors, craftsmen, farmers, traders, all united under one roof." As their longship glided toward the dock, Signe found herself studying the faces of those who gathered to welcome their Jarl home. There was genuine affection in their expressions, she realized with surprise. These were not subjects cowering before a tyrant, but people genuinely pleased to see their leader return safely. Children ran alongside the dock as the ship was made fast, calling out greetings that Einar returned with warm smiles and gentle jokes. When the time came to disembark, Signe felt her old fears returning. The careful treatment she had received aboard the ship might have been temporary courtesy, maintained only while Einar's attention was focused on her. Now, surrounded by his own people in his own stronghold, would the Jarl remember that she was property purchased to settle a debt? But once again, her expectations proved wrong. As the warriors prepared to help her from the ship to the dock, Einar himself stepped forward. "Allow me," he said quietly, and before she could protest, he had lifted her as easily as a child, carrying her the few steps to solid ground before setting her gently on her feet and placing her walking sticks in her hands. The gesture was witnessed by dozens of his people, and Signe saw the message it sent as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. This woman was under his personal protection. She was to be treated with respect and courtesy. Anyone who harmed or insulted her would answer to him directly. "Ingrid," Einar called to a woman who approached from the direction of the great hall, "please see that our guest is made comfortable. She has traveled far and will need time to rest before the evening meal." The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 40 winters old, with graying brown hair braided in the complex style that marked her as a person of authority. Her dress was fine wool dyed deep blue, and silver brooches at her shoulders indicated wealth and status. When she smiled at Signe, the expression reached her eyes with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," Ingrid said, her voice carrying the musical accent of the far northern settlements. "I am Ingrid Haraldsdottir, keeper of the Jarl's household. Come, let me show you to your quarters." As they made their way through the settlement, Signe found herself overwhelmed by the sheer scale and prosperity of the place. Her clan's entire population could have fit comfortably in just the main courtyard of Einar's hall. Workshops lined the pathways, their open doors revealing smiths working iron into tools and weapons, weavers creating cloth of remarkable fineness, and woodcarvers shaping everything from simple bowls to elaborate ship ornaments. "How many people live here?" she asked Ingrid as they walked. "Just over 300, as the Jarl said, though that number grows each season as word of his fairness spreads. Many come seeking work or protection, and few are turned away if they prove willing to contribute to our community." The quarters Ingrid led her to were another surprise. Instead of the cramped corner or storage shed she had expected, Signe found herself in a real room with stone walls, a proper bed with furs and woolen blankets, and even a small table with a chair beside a narrow window that looked out over the fjord. It was better accommodation than she had enjoyed even before her accident, when she had been a valued daughter rather than a burden. "There are fresh clothes in the chest," Ingrid explained, indicating a wooden box carved with the same intricate knotwork that decorated the hall's beams. "The evening meal is served when the horn sounds, but if you prefer to rest tonight, I can have food brought to you here." Signe started to speak, then stopped, overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to her. "Why are you being so generous?" "I'm not a guest. I'm property your Jarl acquired to settle a debt." Ingrid's expression grew thoughtful, and she settled herself on the room's single chair with the ease of someone accustomed to having difficult conversations. "May I speak plainly?" Signe nodded, sinking onto the edge of the bed and leaning her walking sticks against the wall. "I have served in this household for 15 years, Ingrid began. "I have seen Einar Bearskull acquire many things: weapons, horses, treasure, land. I've never seen him treat any acquisition the way he treated you today. When he carries something off a ship personally, when he assigns it quarters in the main hall rather than the outbuildings, when he orders his household keeper to see to its comfort that something has become far more than property." The implications of those words settled over Signe like a heavy cloak. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever the Jarl saw in you during those negotiations, it was significant enough to change his plans. You were not brought here to be a slave or a servant. You were brought here for some purpose he has not yet revealed, but which he clearly considers important." As if to underscore Ingrid's words, voices could be heard in the corridor outside. Einar's deep tones mixed with those of his advisors as they passed by on their way to the war room. Even through the stone walls, his presence seemed to fill the space, a reminder of the power and authority that now shaped her fate. "What should I do?" Signe asked quietly. Ingrid rose from her chair with a gentle smile. "Rest tonight, eat well. Tomorrow you can begin to discover what the Jarl saw in you that your own people missed. But I suspect you already know, deep in your heart, that it was something remarkable." After the older woman left, Signe sat alone in her unexpected luxury, fingering the silver arm ring that marked her new status. For the first time in 3 years, she began to wonder if her story might have a different ending than the one she had written for herself. The ancient chess set that sat on the table in Einar's private chamber had been carved from walrus ivory and jet-black stone. its pieces worn smooth by countless games played over generations. The White King bore the weathered features of some long-dead ruler, while the Black Queen's face had been carved with such skill that she seemed to be watching the game with intelligent eyes. It was before this board that Signe found herself 3 days after her arrival, facing the legendary berserker in a battle of minds rather than steel. "Your move," Einar said quietly, his massive fingers surprisingly gentle as he adjusted the position of his knight. They had been playing for nearly an hour, and Signe had managed to hold her own against a man whose tactical brilliance was spoken of in hushed tones across the northern kingdoms. She studied the board carefully, her mind working through the implications of each possible move. The game had begun as a casual suggestion after the evening meal, when Einar had noticed her watching the carved pieces with obvious interest. What had started as polite entertainment had evolved into something more serious, as both players recognized the skill of their opponent. "You learned this from the old king's court," she said, not quite making it a question as she moved her bishop to threaten his exposed rook. "From my time with the Danes, actually. They had acquired the game from traders who dealt with the courts of Francia." Einar's pale eyes studied the board, but she sensed part of his attention was focused on her. "You play like someone who has spent considerable time thinking through complex problems." It was true, though she doubted he understood how accurate his observation was. During the long months of recovery after her accident, when movement had been agony and her future seemed bleaker with each passing day, her mind had become her refuge. She had memorized every saga the skalds told, worked through mathematical puzzles her father's steward had taught her, and imagined elaborate strategies for problems that existed only in her thoughts. "When your body fails you, your mind becomes more important," she replied, capturing his rook with a move he had clearly not anticipated. "I had considerable time to practice thinking." A smile tugged at the corners of Einar's mouth, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him. "Indeed, and what conclusions did all that thinking lead you to?" The question carried weight beyond their game, and Signe found herself considering her words carefully. In the 3 days since her arrival at Ravenshollow, she had been treated with a respect that still felt surreal. Servants bowed when they passed her in the corridors. Warriors who could break her in half stepped aside with polite nods. Even the children seemed to understand that she held some special status in their community. But she had also been watching, observing the way Einar's household functioned with the same careful attention she had once given to her weaving. What she had seen intrigued her far more than the luxury of her quarters or the deference of his people. "I concluded that strength comes in many forms," she said finally, moving her queen to a position that would force him to sacrifice his bishop or face checkmate in 3 moves. "And that the most dangerous opponents are often those who appear weakest." Einar studied the board for a long moment before conceding the game with a graceful nod. Wisely played, both the game and the conversation. As he began resetting the pieces for another match, Signe found the courage to voice the questions that had been building in her mind. "Why am I here?" "Really here, I mean. Not the official reason about settling debts, but the true purpose." The giant warrior's hands stilled over the chess pieces, and for a moment she thought he might deflect her question with the same diplomatic skill he had shown during their game. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with the same intensity he had brought to analyzing her chess strategy. "Tell me what you have observed since arriving at Ravenshollow," he said. "What have you noticed about my people, my methods of leadership?" The shift from answering to questioning felt familiar. It was the same technique her father had used when teaching her to think through complex problems. Einar was testing her, evaluating not just her intelligence, but her ability to see patterns and draw conclusions from incomplete information. "Your people genuinely respect you," she began slowly, organizing her thoughts as she spoke. "But more than that, they trust you. That's unusual for someone with your reputation for violence. They know you're capable of terrible things, but they also know you won't turn that violence on them without just cause. Continue." Your household is remarkably diverse. You have warriors, yes, but also craftsmen, scholars, even former thralls who have earned their freedom. You value competence over birth, results over tradition. She paused, studying his face for some sign of whether she was interpreting correctly. You're building something new here. Not just another warrior's hall, but a different kind of power structure entirely. Einar's pale eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. And what role do you think a crippled woman might play in such a structure? The blunt words might have stung if they had come from anyone else, but from him they felt like an honest assessment rather than an insult. Someone who has learned to see clearly because she cannot act on impulse. Someone whose counsel might be trusted because she has no obvious agenda for personal gain. Someone who understands what it means to be underestimated. All true, he agreed. But there's something more specific. Something I need that no amount of silver or steel can provide. Before she could ask what that might be, the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor interrupted them. A moment later, one of Einar's scouts burst through the door without ceremony, a breach of protocol that spoke to the urgency of his message. Jarl Einar, the man gasped, still breathing hard from whatever journey had brought him here. Word from the south. Magnus the Red has declared himself king of the western fjords. He's demanding tribute from all the clan leaders, including you. The transformation in Einar was immediate and startling. The relaxed chess player vanished, replaced by the calculating war leader whose reputation had been built on a foundation of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. But what surprised Signe was that his pale eyes immediately shifted to her, as if her reaction to this news was somehow important to his own decision-making process. Magnus the Red, she said thoughtfully, her mind automatically beginning to analyze the implications. The one who claims descent from the old royal bloodlines? The same, Einar confirmed. What do you know of him? His grandfather was a wise king, but Magnus inherited only the ambition, not the wisdom. He's dangerous because he believes his own propaganda about divine right to rule. She paused, seeing something in Einar's expression that confirmed her growing suspicion about why she was really here. You're planning to oppose him? Planning to oppose him, yes. But first I need to understand him, his weaknesses, his blind spots, the flaws in his thinking that might be exploited. Einar's gaze held hers steadily. That kind of analysis requires a mind that can see patterns others miss. A mind that has learned patience through adversity and gained wisdom through suffering. As the full implications of his words settled over her, Signe realized that her life had just taken another dramatic turn. She had been purchased not as property, but as a weapon, one whose true edge lay not in steel, but in thought. The war horn that hung in Einar's great hall was carved from the tusk of some ancient beast, its surface etched with runes that told the story of battles won and enemies vanquished. When blown, its deep voice could be heard across the entire fjord, summoning warriors from distant settlements to answer their Jarl's call. But today it remained silent on its iron hooks, a reminder of the gathering storm that Magnus the Red's declaration had brought to their doorstep. Signe sat at the high table during the morning meal, her position beside Einar marking her elevated status in ways that still felt surreal. Around them, the great hall buzzed with subdued conversation, as warriors, advisors, and clan leaders discussed the implications of Magnus's ultimatum. The demand for tribute had been delivered with typical royal arrogance. Submit or face the consequences of defying a rightful king. He's moving faster than we anticipated, said Bjorn Ironside, Einar's chief military advisor, and a man whose scars told the story of a lifetime spent in battle. Our scouts report that 3 clans have already bent the knee rather than risk his displeasure. Which 3? Einar asked, his voice carrying the same calm authority he brought to chess games and diplomatic negotiations. Hakon the Bold, surprisingly, Eric Redbeard, and Magnus's own cousin, Thorvald Bloodaxe. Bjorn's expression showed his distaste for leaders who would surrender without even attempting resistance. All warriors of reputation, now reduced to paying tribute to a man who has never won a battle himself. Signe listened to the discussion while her mind worked through the implications of each piece of information. In the week since Magnus's declaration, she had become an unofficial advisor to Einar's war council, her insights valued despite her lack of military experience. What she brought to their deliberations was a different perspective, the ability to see political patterns where others saw only tactical considerations. The speed of their submission tells us something important, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation around the table. They're not responding to Magnus's military strength because he hasn't demonstrated any. They're responding to something else. Einar turned to her with the focused attention she had learned to associate with his most serious moments. What else could inspire such rapid submission? Fear of being isolated, she replied, organizing her thoughts as she spoke. Magnus isn't just demanding tribute, he's forcing each clan leader to make a public choice. Submit and gain the protection of the royal banner, or stand alone against whatever consequences he threatens. The first few submissions make the next ones easier, because no one wants to be the last holdout facing his full attention. Around the table, weathered warriors nodded with grudging respect for her analysis. In the days since her arrival, Signe had proven herself capable of insights that eluded men with decades of combat experience. Her mind worked differently than theirs, finding patterns in behavior where they focused on weapons and tactics. So what do you recommend? Asked Gunnar Stormcrow, a jarl from the eastern settlements who had arrived the previous evening seeking alliance against Magnus's threats. Before Signe could answer, Einar raised a hand for silence. The gesture was subtle but absolute. In his hall, under his protection, she would not be challenged or dismissed by visiting leaders who might question her authority to offer counsel. The message was clear to everyone present. Her words carried his endorsement. Magnus's strategy depends on momentum, she continued, her confidence growing as she saw the council members listening intently. Each submission makes the next one more likely, but that same momentum becomes a weakness if it can be broken. One significant clan standing firm against him, especially one with your reputation, Jarl Einar, could encourage others to reconsider their hasty decisions. You're suggesting we make ourselves a target, Bjorn observed. Though his tone suggested consideration rather than criticism, I'm suggesting we make ourselves a symbol, Signe corrected. Magnus rules through fear of consequences he hasn't yet had to deliver. If we force him to actually demonstrate those consequences, we might discover they're less fearsome than his reputation suggests. The discussion that followed stretched well past the normal end of the morning meal, with messengers coming and going as additional intelligence arrived from across the fjords. Each report painted a clearer picture of Magnus's methods, theatrical displays of power, brutal punishments for symbolic transgressions, and a carefully cultivated image of inevitability that made resistance seem futile. But Signe found herself studying the patterns behind the obvious displays, looking for the weaknesses that always existed beneath surface strength. When the council finally dispersed to prepare for the challenges ahead, Einar asked her to remain behind. "You're holding something back," he said once they were alone in the great hall. "Something you didn't want to discuss in front of the others." She had learned not to be surprised by his perceptiveness. In the time since her arrival, she had come to understand that Einar's reputation for tactical brilliance rested on his ability to read people as clearly as he read battlefields. Nothing escaped his attention for long. "Magnus's rapid success troubles me," she admitted. 3 experienced clan leaders don't surrender that quickly unless they know something we don't. Either he has military strength we haven't discovered, or he has leverage we don't understand. What kind of leverage? Signe moved to the great hearth, where a map of the northern kingdoms had been painted on the wall in intricate detail. Her walking sticks clicked against the stone floor as she traced the territories that had already submitted to Magnus's demands. "Look at the pattern," she said, pointing to the locations of the clans that had bent the knee. "They're not clustered together for mutual defense. They're not the weakest or most vulnerable, but they all share one characteristic. Their territories control key trade routes to the southern kingdoms. Einar joined her at the map, his pale eyes following her finger as she outlined the connections. You think he's threatening their economic survival rather than their military security? I think he's already begun economic warfare. And the tribute demand is just the public face of a more sophisticated campaign. Cut off their trade partners, disrupt their supply lines, make their people hungry. And suddenly paying tribute looks like wisdom rather than cowardice. The implications of her analysis settled over them like a cold wind from the mountains. If Magnus was already waging economic war against his targets, then military preparations alone would not be sufficient to resist him. They would need to think like merchants and diplomats, as well as warriors. This changes our entire approach, Einar said finally. If you're right, we're not just facing a would-be king with delusions of grandeur. We're facing someone who understands that power in our age comes from controlling resources as much as wielding swords. As they stood together before the painted map, Signe felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her insights were no longer academic exercises or chess game strategies. They were calculations that would determine the fate of hundreds of people who now looked to Einar for protection. The burden was heavier than she had expected, but for the first time since her accident, she felt truly useful again. The weathered scroll that arrived with the evening tide bore the seal of Magnus the Red, himself a crude imitation of the ancient royal, insignia that managed to be both pretentious and historically inaccurate. Signe held the parchment carefully as she read its contents aloud to Einar's assembled war council, her voice steady despite the inflammatory nature of the message within. To Einar, called Bearskull, who holds lands in the northern fjords by grace of stronger men than himself, she read, pausing to let the insult register with the assembled warriors. Your prideful silence in response to our reasonable demands has been noted with displeasure. Since you seem incapable of understanding the wisdom of submission, we shall provide education in the language you apparently prefer. Around the table, weathered faces hardened with anger, but Einar himself remained calm as winter stone. He had learned long ago that emotional responses to provocations were exactly what enemies hoped to inspire, and Magnus's clumsy attempt at manipulation was almost laughably obvious in its intent. Continue, he said quietly when Signe paused. By the time you receive this message, your trading partner, Olaf the Merchant, will have discovered that his ships are no longer welcome in southern ports. Your ally, Ragnar Whitecloak, will find his grain shipments mysteriously delayed by administrative concerns. Your people will begin to understand that defying rightful authority carries consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Signe looked up from the scroll, her expression troubled. It's signed with his mark and witnessed by 3 jarls who now serve him. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Magnus wasn't just threatening future economic pressure, he was announcing that it had already begun. The systematic campaign Signe had suspected was now confirmed, and its effects would soon be felt throughout Einar's territories. How long before we feel the impact? asked Gunnar Stormcrow, his weathered face showing concern for the first time since the crisis began. Olaf's next shipment was due to return within the fortnight, replied Thorstein the Grey, Einar's chief steward and the man responsible for managing the complex web of trade relationships that kept Ravenshollow prosperous. If Magnus has truly cut off his southern routes, we'll know soon enough. Signe found herself studying the scroll more carefully, noting details that others might have missed. The parchment itself was of fine quality, probably imported from the southern kingdoms. The ink was fresh, the handwriting crisp and confident. But there were subtle inconsistencies that troubled her, small details that suggested more than they revealed. "May I see the seal more closely?" she asked, and Einar handed her the message without question. As she examined the wax impression under the flickering torchlight, her suspicions crystallized into certainty. The seal was indeed an imitation of royal insignia, but it was a very good imitation. too good for someone merely pretending to royal authority. The craftsmanship spoke of access to authentic examples, possibly even the original tools used to create royal documents. This wasn't made by someone copying royal seals from memory, she said slowly. This was made by someone who has had access to genuine royal documents. Recent ones. The implications struck the council like a physical blow. If Magnus had allies among the established royal courts of the southern kingdoms, then his campaign was far more dangerous than they had initially understood. He wasn't just a local strongman with delusions of grandeur. He was potentially the northern representative of a broader political movement. Which kingdoms? Einar asked, his voice carrying the same deadly calm that had earned him his fearsome reputation. Signe studied the scroll again, looking for any additional clues that might reveal the scope of Magnus's support. The parchment comes from Francia, but that only tells us about his trade connections. The seal work suggests someone with access to Danish royal documentation. The style is distinctive. But there's something else. She paused, organizing her thoughts before continuing. The language in this message is too sophisticated for someone like Magnus. I've heard him speak, and while he's not stupid, he lacks the education that would produce this kind of formal diplomatic prose. Someone else wrote this for him. Around the table, the assembled leaders exchanged glances that spoke of growing concern. A local threat was one thing. Northern jarls had been fighting each other for generations, and the conflicts rarely extended beyond their immediate territories. But if Magnus represented a broader alliance of southern powers seeking to extend their influence northward, then the very independence of all the northern clans was at stake. We need more information, Einar said finally. Thorstein, send discreet inquiries to our trading partners in the southern kingdoms. I want to know which courts Magnus has been visiting and what promises he's been making, and our response to his ultimatum, asked Bjorn Ironside. Before Einar could answer, Signe spoke up with an observation that had been troubling her since she first read the message. He's made a tactical error. This scroll reveals far more about his methods and alliances than he probably intended. If we respond carefully, we might be able to turn his own intelligence against him. How so? Magnus expects us to react with typical warrior pride. Angry defiance, immediate military preparations, perhaps raids against his supporters to demonstrate our strength. That's the kind of response this message was designed to provoke. She set the scroll on the table and met Einar's pale eyes directly. But what if we respond like merchants instead of warriors? What if we treat this as a business negotiation rather than a declaration of war? The suggestion was so unexpected that several council members actually laughed before they realized she was serious. The idea of treating Magnus's threats as mere business correspondence was foreign. To men who had spent their lives resolving disputes with sword and axe, but Einar's expression showed thoughtful consideration rather than amusement. Continue your reasoning. If Magnus is waging economic war, then he expects us to respond with military action that will justify escalation on his part. But if we respond with economic countermeasures, if we treat him like a dishonest merchant trying to manipulate a trade dispute, then we force him to either escalate beyond his original plan or reveal the limits of his actual power. The more she spoke, the more convinced she became that this approach offered their best chance of exposing Magnus's true capabilities. We send a polite reply, acknowledging his concerns about trade disruptions and offering to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements for resolving any misunderstandings. We treat his royal pretensions as irrelevant commercial posturing, and if he escalates to actual military action, Gunnar asked, then we learn whether his threats have substance behind them, Signe replied. But more importantly, we force him to act before he's fully prepared. And we do it in a way that makes him look like the aggressor to any neutral observers. As the council continued their discussions well into the night, Signe found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been a burden her own clan was eager to discard. Now she sat at the war table of one of the most powerful jarls in the northern kingdoms, offering counsel that could determine the fate of thousands. The transformation still felt surreal, but the weight of responsibility was becoming increasingly real. The blood-stained cloak that Thorstein the Grey carried into the Great Hall belonged to Olaf the merchant, though the man who had worn it was nowhere to be found. The fabric bore the distinctive blue and silver pattern that had marked Olaf's trading expeditions for over a decade, but now it was torn and soaked with enough blood to suggest its owner had met a violent end. What troubled Signe most as she examined the garment was not the blood itself, but the deliberate way it had been arranged when discovered, folded carefully and placed where Einar's scouts would be certain to find it. Where exactly was this found? She asked Thorstein, her mind already working through the implications of what they were seeing. On the shore near Whale Bay, about a day's ride south of here. My scouts found it at dawn, placed on a driftwood log, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. The old steward's voice carried the weight of bad news delivered too many times. There was no sign of Olaf himself, no wreckage from his ships, no indication of what happened to his crew. Around the war table, the assembled council members studied the bloody cloth with expressions ranging from anger to concern. The disappearance of their primary trading partner was a serious blow to Ravenshallow's economic position, but Signe found herself more troubled by the theatrical nature of the discovery than by its immediate implications. "This is meant to send a message," Einar said quietly, his pale eyes studying the cloak with the same analytical intensity he brought to chess problems. "Magnus wants us to know that he can reach our allies wherever they might be. Or he wants us to believe he can," Signe corrected, surprised by her own boldness in contradicting the legendary Jarl in front of his war council. "There's something about this that doesn't feel right." Before Einar could ask her to elaborate, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Through the great hall's windows, they could see a small party of riders approaching under a banner of parley, the traditional white cloth that indicated peaceful intentions. At their head rode a figure that, even at a distance, was recognizable as Magnus the Red himself. "Bold of him to come here personally," Bjorn Ironside observed, his hand instinctively moving toward his sword hilt. "Either very confident or very foolish." "Both, I suspect," Einar replied, but his attention remained focused on Signe's troubled expression. "What bothers you about the cloak?" She organized her thoughts quickly, knowing that Magnus's arrival would interrupt any detailed analysis. "The blood pattern is wrong. If Olaf had been killed violently, the blood would have soaked into the fabric differently. This looks like blood was poured onto the cloth after it was removed from his body. You're suggesting the entire thing is staged. I'm suggesting we shouldn't assume Olaf is dead until we have more evidence than a bloody cloak placed where we were meant to find it." She paused as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the entrance corridor. "Magnus is here to see our reaction to his message. We should be very careful what we show him. The man who entered Einar's great hall bore little resemblance to the fearsome warrior king his propaganda proclaimed him to be. Magnus the Red was of average height and build, with the soft look of someone who had spent more time in comfortable halls than on battlefields. His red hair was carefully braided, and his clothes were fine enough to mark him as wealthy. But there was nothing in his bearing that suggested the divine authority he claimed to possess. What struck Signe immediately was his smile. Too broad, too confident for someone entering the stronghold of a potential enemy. He moved through the hall like a man visiting old friends rather than negotiating with rivals, and his small escort seemed more ceremonial than protective. Everything about his presence suggested someone who felt completely secure. Despite being surrounded by warriors who could kill him without breaking a sweat, Einar Bearskull, Magnus called out cheerfully as he approached the high table. "I trust you received my recent correspondence?" "I did," Einar replied with careful neutrality, "though I found some of its content surprising." "Ah, yes, the unfortunate matter of your trading partner. Such a shame when business relationships encounter unexpected difficulties. Magnus's tone carried false sympathy that might have fooled someone less perceptive than Signe. I hope his disappearance won't cause too much inconvenience for your people. The casual way he referenced Olaf's fate confirmed Signe's growing suspicions. Magnus was too comfortable, too confident for someone who had recently ordered a brutal murder. He was acting like someone delivering a performance rather than discussing actual violence, which suggested the violence itself might be equally theatrical. Before we discuss business arrangements, Einar said carefully, perhaps you could clarify the current status of our mutual friend Olaf? We've received conflicting reports about his welfare. For just a moment, Magnus's practiced smile faltered. It was a tiny hesitation, barely noticeable, but Signe caught it and filed it away as confirmation of her suspicions. Magnus knew something about Olaf's location, but not what Einar might know or suspect about the circumstances. I'm afraid I can't provide much clarity on that matter, Magnus replied, his smile returning at full strength. The seas can be dangerous for merchants who find themselves unable to secure proper protection for their ventures. Indeed they can, Signe said quietly, speaking for the first time since Magnus's arrival. Though it's unusual for merchants to disappear so completely while leaving their personal effects so conveniently placed for discovery, Magnus's attention shifted to her with obvious surprise. He had clearly expected to negotiate with Einar and his military advisors, not with a woman whose presence at the war table challenged his assumptions about how northern jarls conducted their affairs. "And you are?" he asked, his tone carrying just enough condescension to be insulting without being overtly rude. "Someone who has had considerable time to study the patterns people create when they attempt deception," Signe replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I find it fascinating how much truth can be revealed by examining what people choose not to say." The verbal sparring that followed revealed more about Magnus's true situation than any intelligence report could have provided. As Signe asked seemingly innocent questions about trade routes and commercial relationships, she began to understand the real scope of his operation. Magnus wasn't the representative of southern royal courts she had initially suspected. He was something both more and less dangerous. When the formal negotiations concluded, an hour later with no agreements reached and barely concealed hostility on both sides, Magnus departed with the same theatrical confidence he had displayed upon arrival. But Signe had learned what she needed to know, and as soon as his party was out of sight, she turned to Einar with excitement barely contained. "Olaf isn't dead," she said with certainty that surprised even herself. "Magnus has him somewhere, probably alive and unharmed, as leverage for future negotiations. But more importantly, Magnus isn't working for the southern kingdoms. He's working for himself, using stolen royal documents and forged credentials to create the impression of broader support. How can you be certain? Because he made the same mistake in person that he made in his written message. He knows too much about royal protocol to be an outsider, but not enough to be a true insider. He's learned these things recently, probably from someone who had legitimate access, but who is no longer available to correct his errors." The implications of her analysis transformed their entire understanding of the threat they faced. Magnus wasn't the advance agent of a southern invasion. He was an ambitious opportunist who had somehow gained access to genuine royal resources and was using them to build his own power base in the northern kingdoms. So, what does that tell us about his actual capabilities? Einar asked. Signe's smile was grim but satisfied. "It tells us that he's far more vulnerable than he wants us to believe, and it gives us the information we need to not just defeat him, but to turn his own deception against him." As night fell over Raven's Hollow, the War Council gathered once more to plan their response to a threat that had proven to be both different and more complex than any of them had initially understood. But for the first time since Magnus's ultimatum had arrived, they were planning from a position of knowledge rather than assumption, and that advantage would prove decisive in the confrontation to come, the iron warhammer that had given Einar his reputation, lay on the weapon rack beside his bed, its massive head catching the firelight as he prepared for what might be his final campaign. Skullcrusher had tasted the blood of 100 enemies, had broken shield walls, and shattered the courage of would-be conquerors. But tonight it rested in silence, while its master contemplated a battle that would be won or lost with words rather than steel. "The ship leaves with the dawn tide," Einar said quietly as he sat beside the fire in his private chambers, his pale eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Are you certain you want to do this? Once we begin, there will be no turning back." Signe adjusted her position in the carved chair that had become her regular seat during their evening strategy sessions, her walking sticks resting against its arm. In the weeks since Magnus's visit, she had thrown herself into planning their counterattack with an intensity that surprised even herself. The woman who had once been traded away like broken goods was about to attempt something that would either restore a kidnapped friend or destroy them all. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied, though her voice carried a tremor that spoke to the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Magnus has built his entire strategy around the assumption that his enemies will respond like traditional warriors. When we respond like merchants and diplomats instead, his whole facade will begin to crumble." The plan they had developed was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than mounting a military assault on Magnus's stronghold, they would arrive as a trading delegation seeking to negotiate new commercial arrangements. Signe would pose as Einar's chief merchant advisor, there to discuss the unfortunate disruptions to their business relationships and explore mutually beneficial solutions. The approach would force Magnus to choose between maintaining his diplomatic pretense or revealing the violent reality behind his carefully crafted image. "The risk is enormous," Thorstein the Grey had warned during their final planning session. "If Magnus sees through the deception, you'll be walking into a trap with no hope of escape." But Signe had recognized something in Magnus's behavior during his visit that convinced her the risk was manageable. His need to maintain the illusion of legitimacy was stronger than his desire for immediate violence. He wouldn't harm a diplomatic delegation without provocation, because doing so would destroy the very image of royal authority he had worked so hard to create. "He'll try to intimidate us," she had explained to the War Council. "He'll make veiled threats and display evidence of his power, but he won't act against legitimate envoys unless we force his hand, because that would reveal him as exactly the kind of outlaw pretender he claims not to be." The key to their strategy lay in Signe's analysis of Magnus's psychological profile. He was a man who had built his identity around being underestimated, who had turned his unremarkable appearance and lack of obvious martial prowess into advantages by learning to manipulate perceptions. But that same psychological makeup made him vulnerable. To someone who understood how his mind worked, he expects people to either fear him or dismiss him, she had told Einar. What he doesn't expect is someone who sees him clearly, neither impressed by his theatre nor fooled by his pretense of harmlessness. That kind of clarity will unsettle him in ways that armies cannot. As they sat together on the night before their departure, Signe found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a burden her own family was eager to discard. Now she was preparing to risk everything on a gamble that could either save hundreds of lives or cost them dearly. The transformation felt both surreal and inevitable, as if her entire life had been leading to this confrontation. "Tell me honestly," Einar said, his deep voice cutting through her reverie. "What are the chances that Olaf is still alive?" It was a question she had been asking herself for weeks, analyzing every scrap of evidence they had gathered about Magnus's methods and motivations. "Better than 50%, she replied after careful consideration. "Magnus needs him alive as leverage, and killing him would eliminate that advantage. But more than that, I don't think Magnus has the stomach for unnecessary killing. He's dangerous because he's clever and ruthless, not because he enjoys violence." And if you're wrong, the possibility haunted her, as it had since they first conceived their plan. If Olaf was already dead, then their rescue mission would become a suicide assault on a fortified position with no hope of success. But the alternative, doing nothing while Magnus consolidated his power and eliminated their allies one by one, seemed even worse. "Then we'll learn that the hard way," she said simply. "But I'd rather die trying to save a friend than live knowing I was too frightened to make the attempt." The conversation that followed touched on subjects they had been avoiding for weeks, the growing bond between them that had nothing to do with strategy or politics. In the months since her arrival at Ravenshollow, Signe had become far more than Einar's advisor. She had become his confidant, his intellectual equal, and something approaching a true partner in ways that transcended the circumstances of their first meeting. "When this is over," Einar said carefully, "regardless of how it ends, I want you to know that bringing you here was the best decision I've made in years. You've changed not just my approach to leadership, but my understanding of what strength really means." The words carried weight that went beyond mere gratitude for her counsel. In them, Signe heard an acknowledgement of her worth that had nothing to do with her utility as a strategic asset. For the first time since her accident, someone valued her not despite her limitations, but because of the perspective those limitations had given her. "I was broken when you found me," she replied, her voice soft with emotion. "Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. You saw something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself." "You were never broken," Einar corrected gently. "You were just forced to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed." The woman who will walk into Magnus's hall tomorrow was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As dawn approached, they made their final preparations with the methodical care of people who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. Signe's merchant disguise was carefully crafted to suggest prosperity without displaying wealth that might provoke robbery. Her walking sticks were replaced with a pair that concealed narrow blades, not weapons she could wield effectively in combat, but tools that might prove useful if escape became necessary. The small delegation that assembled at the dock included Einar, Signe, 2 warriors disguised as bodyguards, and Thorstein carrying ledgers and documents that would support their cover story. To any observer, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed: successful merchants seeking to resolve trade disputes through negotiation rather than conflict. "Remember," Signe said as they boarded the longship that would carry them to Magnus's stronghold, "we're not going there to fight. We're going there to reveal the truth. Everything depends on maintaining that distinction until the moment we choose to abandon it." The journey south took most of the day, with their ship following coastlines that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they moved deeper into territory that Magnus claimed as his own. Other vessels gave them wide berth, whether from fear of the famous dragon-carved prow or simple caution regarding unknown travelers. By evening, they could see the smoke rising from Magnus's settlement, marking their destination with fingers of grey against the darkening sky. "Last chance to reconsider," Einar said quietly as they prepared to enter the harbour that would either vindicate their strategy or become their tomb. Signe looked back at him with eyes that held no trace of doubt or hesitation. "I've spent 3 years learning that being underestimated is the greatest advantage I can have. Tomorrow, we'll discover whether that lesson was worth learning." As their longship glided toward the dock, where Magnus's guards waited with expressions of suspicious curiosity, Signe found herself oddly calm. The woman who had been traded away like broken goods was about to attempt something that would either establish her as one of the most dangerous minds in the northern kingdoms, or ensure that her story ended in failure and disgrace. But for the first time in years she felt truly alive. The golden chalice that sat on Magnus's high table was clearly stolen, not because of any obvious markings or inscriptions, but because it was far too fine for a man of his actual background and resources. As Signe studied the ornate vessel during their formal introduction to Magnus's court, She recognized the craftsmanship as Frankish, probably looted from some monastery or noble household during a raid that Magnus had either participated in or purchased the proceeds from. It was exactly the kind of detail that confirmed her analysis of his character, impressive to those who didn't look closely, but revealing to anyone who understood what they were seeing. "Welcome to my hall," Magnus announced with the theatrical grandeur that marked all his public performances. "I confess myself surprised to see the mighty Einar Bearskull arrive under a merchant's banner rather than a war chief's. The great hall where they conducted their negotiations was an obvious attempt to impress visitors with displays of wealth and power. Tapestries that had clearly been acquired from multiple sources hung from the walls in a riot of conflicting styles and periods. Weapons and armor were arranged in careful displays that suggested martial prowess, while revealing to Signe's trained eye that most had never seen actual combat. Everything about the space spoke of a man desperately trying to create an impression of legitimacy through accumulated symbols. "Trade is the foundation of prosperity," Einar replied with diplomatic calm, settling into the chair that had been provided for him while maintaining the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "War is merely one tool among many for resolving disputes." Signe took her position slightly behind and to the left of Einar's chair, playing the role of advisor and scribe while studying Magnus's retinue for signs of Olaf's presence. The assembled court included warriors, servants, and what appeared to be several genuine merchants who had thrown their lot in with Magnus's growing power. But it was the man standing in the shadows near the back of the hall who caught her attention, tall, graying, and bearing the careful posture of someone trying not to be noticed. "Of course, certain trade relationships have encountered unfortunate complications recently," Magnus continued, his tone carrying false regret. "The loss of your partner Olaf, for instance. Such tragedies remind us all how dangerous the merchant's life can be." "Indeed," Signe said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the hall. "Though we've received conflicting reports about the exact nature of that tragedy. Some suggest it may have been less final than originally supposed." The words were carefully chosen to test Magnus's reaction, and they produced exactly the response she had hoped for. His practiced smile flickered for just a moment, and his eyes darted unconsciously toward the shadowed corner where the tall figure stood. It was a tiny tell, barely noticeable, but it confirmed what she had suspected since examining Olaf's bloody cloak. "Conflicting reports are unfortunately common when dealing with maritime disasters," Magnus replied, recovering his composure quickly. "The sea rarely returns what it takes, but Signe had seen what she needed to see. Olaf was here, somewhere in this very building, probably being held as leverage for exactly this kind of negotiation." The knowledge gave her confidence as she began the delicate process of maneuvering Magnus into revealing more than he intended. "Perhaps we might discuss arrangements for replacing those disrupted trade relationships," she suggested, opening the leather portfolio she carried and withdrawing documents that Thorstein had carefully prepared. "We have detailed records of volumes, routes, and profit margins that might interest potential new partners." What followed was an hour of careful verbal sparring disguised as commercial negotiation. Signe presented legitimate trade proposals while watching Magnus's reactions for clues about his true situation. Gradually, a picture emerged of a man who had overextended himself badly, making promises to too many people, claiming authority he didn't actually possess, and desperately trying to maintain an increasingly fragile facade. "Your proposals are intriguing," Magnus said finally, "but they assume a level of stability in current political arrangements that may not be realistic. The northern kingdoms are entering a period of significant change, and wise merchants align themselves with emerging powers rather than clinging to outdated loyalties. Change can indeed create opportunities," Signe agreed, "though it can also create vulnerabilities for those who move too quickly without adequate preparation." The comment was deliberately provocative, designed to test whether Magnus would reveal defensive anger or maintain his diplomatic pose. His response told her everything she needed to know about his psychological state. He was feeling increasingly trapped by his own deceptions and growing desperate for validation of his chosen path. Some might view caution as weakness, he replied, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there earlier. And others might view recklessness as foolishness, Signe countered smoothly. The most successful merchants are those who understand the difference between calculated risk and wishful thinking. As the formal negotiations continued, she began implementing the strategy she and Einar had developed during their long planning sessions. Instead of challenging Magnus's claims directly, she was undermining them with gentle questions and observations that forced him to either provide details he couldn't support or retreat from positions he had staked out too boldly. With each exchange, his confidence eroded slightly, and his need to prove himself grew stronger. The broken royal seal that lay scattered across Magnus's table in pieces of red wax was the final proof of everything Signe had suspected about his fraudulent authority. As his rage finally overwhelmed his carefully maintained composure, Magnus had swept the forged documents from his table in a gesture that revealed far more than he intended. Among the scattered parchments, she could see correspondence with southern courts that bore obvious signs of forgery, trade agreements that referenced non-existent royal privileges, and the tools he had been using to create false credentials. Enough. Magnus snarled, abandoning all pretense of diplomatic courtesy as Signe's gentle probing finally broke through his psychological defenses. You think you're clever, sitting there with your crippled legs and your merchant's ledgers, but you understand nothing about the realities of power. The transformation was dramatic and complete. The polished courtier who had greeted them with theatrical charm vanished, replaced by the desperate opportunist that Signe had recognized beneath the surface. His carefully braided hair was disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. His fine clothes were wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, and his eyes held the wild look of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. I understand more than you think, Signe replied calmly, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to unsettle him further. For instance, I understand that the royal seal you've been using to authenticate your documents was stolen from a Danish messenger who probably thought he was conducting routine diplomatic business. Magnus's face went pale, confirming her deduction. During their verbal sparring, she had noticed inconsistencies in his references to Danish court procedures that suggested second-hand knowledge rather than direct experience. The stolen seal explained how he had gained access to authentic royal materials. Without actually having royal support, I understand that your alliance with southern kingdoms exists only in forged correspondence. That wouldn't fool anyone with genuine court experience, she continued, rising from her chair with careful dignity despite her walking sticks. And most importantly, I understand that you're holding Olaf the merchant somewhere in this very building, probably in your storage chambers, hoping to use him as leverage once your other deceptions were exposed. The accuracy of her analysis struck Magnus like physical blows, each revelation stripping away another layer of the identity he had constructed for himself. Around the hall, his retinue began to shift nervously as they realized the extent to which their leader had been deceiving them about his true situation. You have no proof of any of these accusations, Magnus said, but his voice lacked conviction, don't I? Signe gestured toward the scattered documents on his table. Those forged trade agreements reference royal privileges that don't exist, cite court officials who died years ago, and claim authority over territories that no Danish king has ever controlled. Any genuine merchant would recognize them as fraudulent within minutes. As she spoke, Einar rose from his own chair with the fluid grace that had made him legendary on battlefields across the northern kingdoms. The giant warrior had remained silent throughout the negotiations, allowing Signe to conduct her intellectual assault on Magnus's defenses. But now his presence filled the hall like gathering thunder. "The time for words is ending," Einar said quietly, his pale eyes fixed on Magnus with predatory intensity. "My advisor has proven that you're a fraud and a kidnapper. Now you have one chance to avoid the consequences of those crimes, produce Olaf unharmed, and we might consider allowing you to live long enough to flee these lands." Magnus's gaze darted around his own hall, searching for support among his followers, but found only uncertainty and growing fear. The warriors, who had seemed so confident in his authority, were beginning to understand that their leader had built his power on foundations of sand and deception. "Even if your accusations were true," Magnus said desperately, "you're outnumbered 10-1 in my own stronghold. Killing me won't help your friend, and it certainly won't help you escape alive." "Who said anything about killing you?" Signe asked with a smile that was more dangerous than any weapon. "Death would be far too simple a solution to the problems you've created." Instead of violence, she began to speak directly to Magnus's assembled followers, her voice carrying clearly throughout the hall as she outlined exactly what their leader had done and how his deceptions had endangered them all. She explained how his forged royal credentials would eventually be discovered by genuine southern authorities, how his economic warfare against neighboring clans would inevitably provoke retaliation, and how his entire strategy depended on maintaining lies that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. "Your choice is simple," she told them. "Continue following a man whose lies will eventually destroy you all, or help us resolve this situation in a way that allows you to rebuild your lives on honest foundations." The psychological pressure was too much for Magnus to withstand. With a broken cry of rage and despair, he pointed toward a door at the rear of the hall and screamed for his guards to bring the merchant forward. Within minutes, Olaf appeared, bruised and thin from his captivity, but very much alive and unbroken, as Einar's disguised warriors moved to secure their friend and ensure their escape route remained open. Signe found herself facing Magnus across the ruins of his carefully constructed empire. The man who had terrorized multiple clans with threats of royal retribution was revealed as nothing more than a clever fraud who had finally encountered someone cleverer than himself. The carved wooden throne that now sat in Ravenshollow's great hall had been crafted specifically for Signe, its proportions designed to accommodate her walking sticks and provide the support she needed for long councils. Unlike the ornate chair that Magnus had used to project false authority, this seat was elegant in its simplicity, carved from a single piece of ancient oak by the settlement's master craftsman, and bearing only the subtle knotwork patterns that marked it as belonging to someone of genuine importance within Einar's household. 3 months had passed since their confrontation with Magnus the Red, and the northern kingdoms had settled into a new stability that few had thought possible. Word of how the legendary Jarl Einar Bearskull's advisor had dismantled a would-be king through wit rather than warfare had spread throughout the fjords, creating a reputation that opened doors previously barred by assumptions about disability and gender. "The delegation from the western clans has arrived," Ingrid announced as she entered the Great Hall, where Signe was reviewing trade agreements that had grown increasingly complex as Ravenshollow's influence expanded. "They're requesting an audience with both you and the Jarl regarding the territorial disputes near Ironwood Valley." Signe set aside the parchments with a satisfied smile. The woman who had once been traded away like broken goods was now sought after by clan leaders across the northern kingdoms, her council valued as highly as any military alliance. The transformation still felt surreal at times, but the constant stream of visitors seeking her wisdom had made it impossible to doubt the reality of her changed circumstances. "Have them shown to the war room," she replied, reaching for her walking sticks with the fluid motion that had become second nature over the years. "I'll join them as soon as I finish reviewing these shipping contracts." The contracts themselves represented another aspect of her transformation. With Magnus exposed as a fraud and his economic warfare schemes collapsed, new trade relationships had flourished throughout the region. Olaf the merchant, fully recovered from his ordeal and grateful beyond words for his rescue, had become the architect of a trading network that connected previously isolated settlements with markets they had never imagined reaching. As she made her way through the corridors of Einar's expanded hall, Signe reflected on the changes that had reshaped not just her own life, but the entire structure of power in the northern kingdoms. The success of their intellectual approach to defeating Magnus had inspired other leaders to seek non-military solutions to long-standing disputes. Conflicts that had simmered for generations were being resolved through negotiation and careful analysis rather than sword and shield. The war room where she met with visiting delegations had been transformed from a place for planning battles into a center for diplomatic innovation. Maps covered the walls, but they showed trade routes and economic relationships rather than military targets. The great table that had once held weapons now supported ledgers, correspondence, and the complex documents that governed increasingly sophisticated political arrangements. Signe was already present when she arrived, discussing boundary disputes with the Western clan representatives with the same careful attention he had once devoted to tactical planning. The sight of him in his element, commanding, thoughtful, but no longer primarily focused on martial solutions, reminded her of how much they had both changed since that first meeting beside her clan's dying fire. "Ah, Signe," he said as she entered, his pale eyes lighting with the warmth that had become increasingly common in their private moments. "Perfect timing. These gentlemen are facing exactly the kind of complex territorial issue that your methods handle so well." The negotiations that followed lasted well into the evening, with Signe guiding the clan representatives through a careful analysis of their underlying concerns, rather than their stated positions. What initially appeared to be irreconcilable differences over grazing rights gradually revealed itself as a misunderstanding about seasonal migration patterns that could be resolved through better communication and modest adjustments to traditional schedules. "You make it look effortless," one of the visiting Jarls commented as they concluded their discussions with agreements that satisfied all parties. "But I suspect this kind of thinking requires considerable skill to master." "It requires a willingness to see past surface appearances," Signe replied. "The same skill that allows you to judge the quality of a horse or the honesty of a trader can be applied to understanding the true nature of political disputes." As the delegation departed with handwritten agreements and renewed respect for diplomatic solutions, Signe found herself alone with Einar in the great hall. The familiar silence of evening was settling over Ravenshollow, broken only by the distant sounds of daily life winding down around them. "Do you ever regret it?" Einar asked quietly as they sat together beside the great hearth. "The life you might have had if that rockfall had never happened." It was a question she had asked herself often during the dark months after her accident, when the future had seemed to hold nothing but diminishing possibilities and increasing irrelevance. But now, surrounded by the evidence of what her mind could accomplish when freed from traditional expectations, the answer came easily. "I regret the pain," she said honestly. "I regret the years I spent believing that my worth was determined by what my body could do rather than what my mind could understand. But the life I might have had, married to some chieftain's son, raising children and managing a household, that was someone else's dream, not mine. And this life?" Signe looked around the great hall that had become her domain, thinking of the problems she had solved, the conflicts she had resolved, and the respect she had earned through the application of intelligence rather than tradition. Most importantly, she thought of the partnership she had built with the man beside her, a relationship based on mutual respect and complementary strengths rather than conventional expectations. "This life is mine," she said with quiet satisfaction, "built by my own choices, shaped by my own efforts, and valued for qualities that no accident could ever touch." As the fire burned lower and the northern lights began their ancient dance across the sky outside, Signe Eriksdottir sat in her carved throne and contemplated a future that stretched ahead of her like an unwritten saga. The woman, who had once been considered worthless, had discovered that true strength comes not from what the body can endure, but from what the mind can envision, and the spirit can achieve. The clan had sold her for being crippled, but the giant Viking had found something far more valuable than they had ever imagined, a strength that could reshape kingdoms and a wisdom that could transform the very nature of power itself.